Emile Stipp is the Chief Actuary at Discovery. You've been causing quite a lot of confusion in the marketplace, Emile, and hopefully you can unpack this for us. First of all, 80% of South Africans have had or been infected by COVID. That's how you're being quoted. Is that correct?
So what I said, Alec, is we estimate between 70 and 80%. So it's in a range, and 80% is the upper end of that range. Unfortunately, we can't be exact about it because, not everybody gets tested. So there's always an element of uncertainty when we talk about infection levels, but we think that that's pretty accurate, that range.
So where is herd immunity?
So herd immunity, actually, I think is something that we must all forget now. It's not going to happen. And the reason for that is that COVID is becoming endemic. So unless you have everybody vaccinated in the population, and unless vaccination or previous infection gives you complete protection against reinfection or infection in the first place, you're not going to get it to go away. So the way that one should think about this is that if you've had COVID before, your risk of getting it again is about 20 to 25% if you come into contact with the virus. Okay, that's what our data shows. Even if you're vaccinated, the data emerging across the world is that you have a risk, roughly about 20% of getting infected. But the key is that your risk of going to hospital and dying, it's different worlds. It's completely different if you're vaccinated versus if you're not. So, and that's really what we should look at. So what you're seeing playing out in Europe and many other places in the world now is that when they get to a certain level of vaccination, the country starts opening up. It happened in Holland, happens in the UK, and infections go up. But what we don't see is that deaths go up. So, what that basically means is that COVID with vaccination is less harmful than influenza. That seems to be the numbers emerging from the UK. Without vaccination, it's much more harmful. It's about 8 to 10 times more harmful. And that's really what we should expect going forward, is that COVID will be around. It will probably not go away. But as long as you're vaccinated, you're basically safe from the bad consequences.
Well, that's excellent insights, because there is a lot of confusion about this. Just to repack again, or to re-emphasize it, if you have a vaccination, the chances are that you will get COVID. Everyone seems to going to get COVID anyway, but you will, as you've just said now, the symptoms are going to be not as bad as a bad flu. However, if you don't get vaccinated, then they will be 8 to 10 times worse. And of course, that's why people are dying of it, I guess.
That's right. Yes. So that's the best way to think about it. But let me just qualify one thing that you said there. It's not that you will get infected. So COVID is highly contagious. You still have to come into contact with it. So remember, either infections, prior infection, or vaccination does reduce the risk of spreading COVID and the risk of getting it. What that means is that when the infection levels in the population is low, like it was between our two waves last year, or between wave 2 and 3, your risk of coming into contact with COVID is actually pretty low as well. So it doesn't mean that you will get vaccinated, will get infected. But if you do, then there is a chance that you get infected. And if you do get infected, then if you're vaccinated, your risk of ending up in hospital and dying is much lower than what it would have been without vaccination. So what we see in the UK now is that the risk is roughly 2 to 3% of what it would be had you not been vaccinated. And that's a material difference. That means that effectively it removes the risk for all practical purposes.
It certainly does. Are the UK hospitals then not being overburdened?
Not at all. Yeah, and what was particularly interesting, if you put the two graphs next to each other, you can see how there's a first wave, a second wave, and then a third wave in the UK when you look at infections. That third wave in the UK was actually higher than it was in South Africa. And then if you look at mortality, at the number of deaths, so in the first wave it went up and down, second wave up and down, third wave it stays flat. Basically, it doesn't even go outside of normal confidence intervals for death rates. Whereas in South Africa, by contrast, in the third wave, you see the deaths rising sharply. It's now starting to come down again. But certainly the third wave's impact was very severe in South Africa, whereas in the UK, almost non-existent.
And the difference between the two being the level of vaccinations.
That's right. So at the moment, roughly 77.5% of all adults in the UK have had 2 doses. Whereas in South Africa, I think the latest numbers I saw was about 9.7%. So it's still a material difference. Fortunately, from what we can tell in South Africa, at least people over 60, there's a higher percentage of them being vaccinated, but it's roughly 50%. So I think that, I mean, to me, the biggest thing we have to deal with is vaccine hesitancy in South Africa. That's the big issue. If people don't get vaccinated, that's when you have this continued risk that there will be further waves, that hospitals will get crowded up, and that a lot of people will die. Literally, the only protection we have against it at the moment is vaccination.
But what if 80%, or let's use the lower number, 70% of South Africans have been infected already? Surely that gives them some kind of natural immunity towards getting COVID.
It does, but let me, I'm pulling out my calculator now, so let me tell you what I'm calculating. So what you have to bear in mind is that as is happening now at the moment, the variants emerging become more and more contagious. Okay, so that's the real thing to be worried about. So let's say that, for argument's sake, 30% of the population is still vulnerable. What you need that R factor of the new variant to be is roughly 3.3. Okay, and what that means is if it hits that point, then effectively it starts spreading again. Then you get a 4th wave, it starts increasing. Now the crucial difference there is, as is in the 3rd wave now, South Africa versus UK, people are vaccinated, their risk is much lower. So then you don't get the curve developing in terms of deaths. If people are not vaccinated, then it does happen. So if people had COVID before, they do have a lower risk of getting reinfected. As I said, between 20 and 25% risk of reinfection, which means that 75 to 80% protection against reinfection. But for those people who do get it and who haven't been vaccinated, then there is still that risk of hospitalization and death. So what that means is over time, these waves will be smaller than what they were when we had no protection. But that's a critical thing. It's a race against time. If we don't get enough people vaccinated, if the R factor is high enough, it breaks through nationally, and then you see that wave emerging again. And by the time it happens, it's too late, right? Then it carries on in the population. As we saw in December, as we saw now in May and June, effectively we didn't have enough people vaccinated to stop that spread from person to person.
Okay, just as an amateur, a rank amateur, so please forgive me for this, but what I've read about vaccines is that it goes into your body, it teaches your body to fight against whatever you're being vaccinated against. So you're building up a defense mechanism. Then you, as happened with me, I had my first Pfizer shot. 3 weeks later, I got COVID. Or tested positive for COVID. It wasn't that bad. I'm still here, so it certainly wasn't as bad as many other people have been affected, and I put that down to having had the first shot.
That's right.
But now that presumably my body has now learned how to fight against this virus, so even if I get it again, I'm hoping that it's unlikely that I'll land up in hospital. Is that the correct thesis?
That's the correct thesis. The only unknown thing there is how long the immunity lasts. So what we don't know is that if you get exposed in 2 or 3 years' time, whether you'd still have the same level of protection. And that's why people are talking about booster shots in many countries in the world. You'll see in Israel that they're already starting with booster shots. What I'm hoping is that the science evolves in such a way that 1 more booster shot, maybe 2 would be enough. Otherwise, eventually what it becomes is something like the flu vaccine that you get every year. So if you're in the risk group, you just get your flu vaccine, you know that you should get it, and then you have protection against hospitalization and death from flu, and maybe COVID becomes something like that. So that's still a possibility, but there is also the possibility that actually the vaccine as it is does give you enough protection, or alternatively, with one more booster shot, you'd have the protection basically for life or for very long. So I think there's, it's just too early to tell because we don't have people that have been post-vaccination 2 years or 3 years. We don't have the data on that yet. But I know that the pharmaceutical companies are working very hard on that to make sure that the booster shots, get updated and that they can respond to any sort of variants emerging in the future.
But the picture here is that 70%, like myself, have had COVID positive in South Africa. Had they been, some of them wouldn't have even known. I think you called it asymptomatic. They wouldn't have even known that they had it. But the other 30% haven't had COVID yet. And if they haven't been vaccinated, they could end up going to hospital and dying. I mean, that's really the danger that I suppose we're going into.
That's the crux of the matter. And as long as more people are not vaccinated, the barriers in the population are not there. So that means that it spreads more easily. So variants can take hold and they can start spreading again. And that's why I say it's a race against time. For any country in the world, that's at the moment the crucial thing. We know that at least for the Delta variant, for what's around in South Africa right at the moment, your best protection is vaccination. I must tell you, Alec, as you know, I live in London. So here, life is back to normal. I can go to concerts, people go to sport games. People don't even wear masks inside buildings because it's not necessary. It's, some people might still get COVID. They isolate for a little bit, but you don't see the deaths and the hospitalizations. So I really do think that it's the only way forward at the moment.
So if they do get COVID now, it's likely that it's going to be, as you said right in the beginning of this discussion, they're not going to be as badly affected as they would if they'd got flu, which is quite extraordinary given how scared the whole world is about COVID.
Yeah. So to give you a sense of that, maybe let me just take you through the numbers quickly. So when we look at the 5 years up until COVID happened, and we look at the average mortality rate of flu in the UK, it was roughly around 200 per million people that died as a result of flu. When COVID hit in the first 2 waves and over the first year of COVID, the death rate from COVID, by contrast, is close to 2,000 per million. So that gives you a sense of why I say it's 10 times higher. When we look now at what happened in the third wave in the UK, so over this period, May and June, and then we annualize that. So currently the observed death rate is roughly 25 out of a million. But let's just say that there's multiple waves, there's in-between periods of waves, so we express that as an annual number. What we get to maximum is 120. That's why I say that it's 40% lower than normal flu. It's 120 versus 200. And what you can see is if you look at the excess death curve now, so when the UK tracks its deaths, and it varies every month, but it stays within a narrow band in normal times before COVID. With COVID, it suddenly goes up and down. Now in the third wave in the UK, it's completely within the normal band. So, it's as clear a demonstration as you can get.
Lovely numbers, thank you. And it certainly does put it into perspective. For people who've had COVID, those 70% of the population, should they still go and get another vaccine?
I would strongly recommend it. All indications are that it gives you stronger protection against hospitalization and death. So, the data, again, it's not that clear because it's not always clear whether people have had COVID or not. It depends on whether the antibody is still present in your body, and that we can't be 100% sure of that. But all indications from what I've seen, is that it gives you much better protection.
And Emile, just to close off with, when Boris Johnson opened the UK on the 19th of July, there were lots of people who said problems are going to begin. There's going to be a wave of hospitalizations and many deaths, etc. He was widely criticized, and it seems as though whoever was advising him was actually more accurate than the critics. What did they get wrong? What was it that didn't cause, or what were they working into their thinking that didn't actually, they weren't taking account of because we didn't have these increases in deaths?
I can't really speak for them, but what I do think that they were worried because the data wasn't that clear yet. So on the 19th of July, we were still in the UK in the sort of upward swing of the third wave. And because there's always a delay of about 2 or 3 weeks before you observe the deaths, what they were worried about is that the deaths will just keep on going up. And then it didn't happen. So there was a lot of, I think many of the people who criticized him at the point, at that time, also did write about it 2 weeks later, 2, 3 weeks later, saying we were wrong, which they were. So I think, I mean, the one thing just to bear in mind is none of us really knows what lies in the future. You know, we're all learning as this develops. Fortunately, in South Africa, we can look at the countries who've had high levels of vaccination, and we can observe what happens over time. Maybe it does go up again. Maybe we do need booster shots at some point in time again. But for now, I think the important thing is that what we do know is that when Delta is around in a country, you have to vaccinate as many people in as short a time as possible. South Africa is actually not doing badly in that, you know, given when the vaccines became available to the country, and also now knowing how many vaccines we have coming. As long as people carry on going for vaccination, you know, we can get a very good deal of protection. Critical thing for us is to do that again before December holidays, when, you know, when everybody travels, when people want to have parties, you want to make sure that everybody is vaccinated at that point. Otherwise, we do stand some risk of it increasing again.
And if you have any doubt, watch the English football over the weekend and you'll see
Exactly.
that life has certainly returned to normal. Just to clarify another issue, if you've had COVID, the chances are 20 to 25% of getting it again. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's
But
right.
it's not going to be even as bad as a flu.
No, if you've had COVID and you haven't been vaccinated, what we see from our data emerging is it's hard to interpret because there's one other variable playing a role, which is your chances of coming into contact with the virus. So as we speak, you know, even though there's 20 to 25% of people who are vulnerable to reinfection, not all of them can come into contact with the virus. So we have a small number of people who have had COVID twice. So roughly about, I think the last number I saw 2 weeks ago was about just over 3,000 people in the discovery population have had it twice. There's a handful of people who've had it 3 times. What we do see for some people who get reinfected is that they do still go to hospital and they have pretty severe episodes and then pretty severe healthcare costs thereafter. It's still a small sample. So again, the data is just emerging now as to what happens when you get reinfected. But to me, the clear message out of that data is just don't take a chance. You know, if there's any doubt in your mind, rather get vaccinated and don't take the chance, because we do see in our data that there are some people who do have still pretty severe hospitalization episodes, and then from what we can tell from the claims data, quite significant costs thereafter even.
And the really good news, I think, for a lot of the vaccine hesitancy is that the FDA this week is going to approve the Pfizer vaccine, according to the Wall Street Journal this morning anyway, approve it rather than just approve it for emergency use. And that'll probably, some people have been concerned, and of course you've got a lot of this of these suggestions that it's experimental, etc. But once the FDA formally approves the vaccine, that should put quite a few minds at rest. Is it a big deal for you from going from emergency use to formal approval?
Not at all. Not at all. I think, I mean, to me, it's just think about it. There are already billions of people that have been vaccinated as we speak. You know, if it really had serious side effects or if it was really dangerous, you would have seen hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people affected by it. And we haven't seen that. You know, as in any population, you do find people having heart attacks, you do find, you know, any sort of complications, but it's not necessarily caused by the vaccine. It just happened at the same time. And what you would see, if you have a few billion people taking any medication, whether it's whatever it is, the pill or, you know, Panado, you'd probably see side effects in the population. So I'm not concerned about that at all. We don't see any evidence in our data so far of any complications after vaccination. There are obviously people that have some reaction against it, but it's a very, very tiny sliver, and it's such a small probability that the risks of that relative to the risks of getting COVID And whatever that entails for you, you don't know until you get it. Those risks are, it's on a different planet, basically, relative to taking the vaccine. So yes, I think, if it gives people comfort, that's great. But just look around you, look at how many people in the world have been vaccinated. And so far, there are no serious reports of any negative consequences. If there were, everybody would have written about it. There would have been a lot of data and governments would have stopped vaccinating.